For 300 years, the Galactic Council had ruled the known galaxy with cold laws, heavy fleets, and the kind of fear that made even proud species lower their heads in silence. And in all that time, they believed there was only one race they still fully understood. Humans from Earth, because to the Council, humans were strange but small, clever but divided, brave but still young compared to the ancient powers that had built empires among the stars. Earth had joined the wider galaxy only 60 years earlier, and unlike other rising civilizations, humans did not rush to conquer, threaten, or kneel. They traded, they explored, they built colonies in quiet corners of space, and they sent diplomats instead of warships whenever trouble began. That calm behavior made many aliens think humanity was harmless. But the older council members did not trust what they could not control. They had watched humans survive disasters that should have broken them, had seen their engineers rebuild destroyed colonies in half the expected time, had studied their soldiers who could fight in poison air, freezing dark, and zero gravity with the same hard focus in their eyes. Still, fear often turned into arrogance when it sat too long on a throne, and in the shining council citadel above the dead white world of Thalen Prime, the most powerful leaders in the galaxy made the worst decision of their long and cruel reign. The trouble had started at the border. For months, human cargo ships had been stopped, searched, and sometimes fired upon by council patrols near neutral routes. Small stations vanished. Trade convoys were delayed. Human colonies sent complaint after complaint, but Earth did not answer with anger. Instead, they sent a diplomat. His name was Kong Jun, a calm man from Earth with dark eyes, steady hands, and the kind of quiet voice that made people listen because he never wasted words. He had once served in the human navy long before becoming a diplomat, but no one in the council cared enough to read that part of his record. To them, he was only a messenger, and messengers were easy to crush. June arrived at the council citadel aboard a small, unarmed diplomatic vessel escorted only by legal transponder beacons and recorded permissions under interstellar law. Many alien observers watched his arrival. Some were curious. Some were afraid. Some hoped the council would finally calm the growing tension. Among those watching was a junior records officer from a neutral species, a woman named Hannah, whose people had long survived by staying silent and careful. She stood high in the witness gallery with a data slate in her hand and felt unease crawl through her chest as June walked into the grand chamber in a simple dark uniform marked only with the blue and silver emblem of Earth. He did not bow. He did not show fear. He only stood before the circular ring of floating council thrones and waited. High Executor Doran, the oldest and cruelest of the council rulers, looked down at him with cold amusement. Doran's voice echoed across the chamber as he accused Earth of violating protected borders, hiding military activity near council lanes, and sending spies under diplomatic cover. The accusations were false, and everyone in the chamber knew it, but the council was not holding a trial. It was staging a warning. June listened without interruption. When Doran finally demanded that Earth surrender its outer colonies for inspection and accept permanent council military oversight, a murmur moved through the chamber. Even the most loyal species knew such a demand was humiliation, not law. June took one slow breath, lifted his head, and answered in simple, clear words. He said Earth had come in peace. He said the attacks on human ships must end. He said the council still had a chance to choose reason over pride. His voice was not loud, but it carried through every level of the chamber like a blade sliding from its sheath. For a second, silence held the room. Then Doran laughed. It was not the laugh of a leader. It was the laugh of a man who believed he could not be touched. He called humans emotional animals hiding behind diplomacy. He said Earth's peace was weakness. He said the galaxy would learn what happened to any species that forgot who ruled the stars. Then, in front of ambassadors, officers, and witnesses from 100 worlds, Doran gave the order that changed history forever. Council guards surrounded Kong Jun. Hannah felt her breath stop. She expected arrest, imprisonment, maybe a staged confession. But Doran wanted blood. He wanted a public lesson. The guards raised shock lances and forced June to his knees on the center platform. Still, the human did not beg. He did not shout. He only looked up at Doran with a calm expression that somehow made the High Executor seem smaller instead of greater. June's final words were recorded by every device in the chamber. He said, "Earth offered peace because peace saves lives. If you strike a human under law, then the law dies with him." Some laughed at that. Some looked away. Hannah gripped her slate so hard her fingers hurt. Doran made a dismissive motion with one clawed hand, and the execution beam fired. A white line of energy cut through the chamber, and Kang Jun fell without a sound. For one terrible second, the entire grand chamber became perfectly still. Then the witnesses erupted in whispers, gasps, and fear. Some ambassadors stood in outrage. Others fled. The guards locked the doors. Doran rose from his throne and declared that humanity had been judged and warned. He thought the moment was complete. He thought the story ended there. But far below the citadel, inside a hidden communications relay that human engineers had legally installed months earlier, a black emergency device awakened. It had been designed for one purpose only. If a human diplomat died under formal protection, all records would be copied, encrypted, and transmitted on channels too old and too deep for the council to track. Within seconds, the execution footage, the chamber audio, Doran's order, and June's final words were moving through silent quantum relays toward Earth. The council never even knew it had happened. On the blue world far across the stars, dawn had just begun over the Pacific when the message arrived in the buried command vault beneath the mountains of Old Korea. Deep under layers of stone, steel, and forgotten war doctrine, officers in gray uniforms watched the recording in absolute silence. No one spoke when the beam fired. No one cursed when Kang Jun fell. At the center of the room stood Admiral Jiho, a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples and a face carved by years of command. Beside him stood Commander Nari, younger, sharp-eyed, and motionless except for the slight tightening of her jaw. The footage ended. The room remained silent for 3 full seconds. Then Jiho asked only one question. "Identity confirmed?" A technician swallowed and answered. "Confirmed. Diplomatic envoy Kang Jun. Council chamber authentication complete. Public execution under protected law." Jiho closed his eyes for the shortest moment, as if giving the dead man the only prayer war could still allow. When he opened them again, all softness was gone. He turned to Nari. "Wake the dormant fleets." Around the command vault, screens came alive like stars exploding into life. Codes older than most human colonies activated. Buried shipyards under lunar craters unlocked. Massive blast doors beneath oceans rolled aside. Hidden docks carved inside asteroids lit up in red and white emergency light. Ancient carrier groups long believed to be scrap drifted free from false debris fields and powered their reactors. On Mars, sirens sounded beneath shield domes. On Europa, black warships rose through frozen vents. In orbit around distant colonies, civilian traffic suddenly changed course under emergency orders as invisible defense platforms decloaked one by one. Humanity had not built an empire of noise. It had built a fortress of patience. Across Earth, the official networks remained calm. No panic, no public rage. Only a simple government message spread to every colony and every station. Diplomatic casualty confirmed, defense condition black, civilian shelter protocols begin immediately. People obeyed with the same frightening discipline the Council had never understood. Parents guided children into shelters. Engineers sealed industrial rings. Miners on the edge of human space powered down drills and powered up hidden rail batteries. Merchant captains rerouted into protected convoys without asking questions. The whole species moved like a single body remembering an old wound. Back in the Council Citadel, Doran was still celebrating. He sent orders for border fleets to tighten pressure on human lanes and expected Earth to respond with protests, fear, maybe desperate negotiations. Instead, within 6 hours, every human embassy in Council territory went dark. Within 10 hours, every human trade route shut down. Within 12 hours, sensor stations along the frontier began reporting impossible mass signatures moving in deep space, too large to be convoys, too organized to be migration fleets, and too many to count. At first, the Council dismissed the reports as false readings. Then an entire border listening post vanished after transmitting only 4 words, human warships emerging everywhere. Hannah, still shaken by what she had seen, remained in the Citadel archives that night, unable to erase June's final image from her mind. She had spent her life recording the lies of powerful beings, but something about the human's last warning stayed with her like cold fire. She pulled old sealed files from restricted history and found fragments the Council had buried, human survival reports, colony recovery statistics, battle simulations marked impossible, and one ancient strategic note from a long-dead Council analyst that read, "If unified, do not provoke." She stared at the line until her hands trembled. Outside the station, alarms suddenly began to howl. Not the slow alarms of drills or accidents, but the sharp rising scream of combat emergency. Red light flooded the archive halls. Personnel started running. Through a viewport, Hannah looked into the dark of space and saw distant lights blooming one after another beyond the defensive ring. At first they looked like stars. Then she realized stars did not form perfect attack patterns. Hundreds of contacts appeared, then thousands, all sliding out of jump space in disciplined silence. Vast black silhouettes blocked the light of Thalen Prime as human battleships, carriers, escort walls, and spear-like destroyers took formation around the Citadel in a scale no one in the Council had imagined possible. At the center of the formation, larger than any warship Hannah had ever seen, a human flagship turned slowly until its forward cannons aligned with the station where Kong Jun had died, and across every channel in the system, in every known language, a single transmission spread like thunder through the stars. "This is Earth Fleet Command. You murdered a protected human under law. Surrender the High Executor and all military command codes. You have one chance." In the Grand Chamber, Doran finally stopped smiling. The silence that followed Earth Fleet Command's demand was more frightening than any scream of battle, because across the Council Citadel, officers, guards, and diplomats suddenly understood that the galaxy had stepped into a war no one had prepared for. And in the center of that storm, High Executor Doran still clung to the old arrogance that had ruled for centuries, believing fear alone could break any enemy. He stood in the Grand Chamber under the red combat lights and shouted for the station's defense grid to activate, for orbital cannons to fire, for every nearby Council patrol group to form a shield around the Citadel. But even as his orders spread through the station, reports came in faster than his commanders could answer them. Human ships were not drifting in random attack lines like angry raiders. They were moving with perfect control, layered in rings and wedges, each class of vessel covering the next with calm precision. Long black carriers hung behind spearhead battleships. Destroyers slid outward like knives. Smaller escort craft formed rotating walls around larger command ships. Beyond them, almost invisible on most scanners, stealth frigates spread through the system like shadows. The Council had expected rage. What arrived instead was discipline. In the human flagship, Admiral Jiho stood on the command deck beneath cold white lights, his hands folded behind his back, his expression still and unreadable. Around him, officers moved with focused speed. Commander Nari stood at tactical control, her eyes fixed on the glowing map of the Citadel system as red enemy markers lit up one after another. She watched the Council fleets scramble from docks and hidden orbits, but she also watched something else, the hesitation in their formations. They were afraid. "Final surrender window closing," she said. Jiho gave a single nod. "Transmit again." Across every channel, the human voice returned, calm and hard as iron. "You executed a protected envoy under interstellar law. Deliver Doran and stand down. This is your last chance." Doran answered with weapons. The outer defense ring of the Citadel opened fire first, launching bright streams of plasma and lances of ion energy toward the nearest human ships, and the Council officers around him cheered too early, because they still believed numbers and station mass could force a retreat. Instead, the human front line shifted with terrifying smoothness. Battleships rotated just enough to angle heavy armor into the incoming fire while smaller interceptor craft surged forward and released clouds of countermeasure drones. The first wave of Council plasma vanished in blooming flashes far from its targets. Then the human fleet struck back. Hannah, still trapped in the archive level with emergency doors sealed, felt the station shake like a living thing in pain. Through the viewport she saw thin white lines cross the darkness almost too fast to follow. They were railgun rounds, fired from human dreadnoughts at such speed that Council shield systems barely had time to register impact. One orbital cannon vanished in a ball of blue fire. Then another. Then 6 more. Entire sections of the Citadel's outer defense grid went dark before the station command could even understand what was happening. Human missiles followed, not wild swarms, but intelligent hunter-killers that curved through the battlefield, avoiding civilian sectors and diving straight into shield nodes, military hangars, and command relays. The Council had spent centuries fighting wars of intimidation and mass bombardment. Humanity had built for surgical destruction. Doran screamed for reserve fleets to attack the flagship, and from behind Thalen Prime's moon, 3 heavy Council battle groups emerged at full thrust, dozens of cruisers and escorts forming a hammer strike toward Jiho's command vessel. On any normal day, such a force could have broken a smaller empire. Jiho only looked at the tactical display and said, "Open Corridor 7. Release the wolves." At his command, a section of the human formation split apart, seemingly leaving a weakness. The Council commanders rushed toward it, convinced they had found an opening. Then space around them erupted. Hidden mines, cloaked before the battle began, activated in perfect sequence. Several Council cruisers shattered before they could raise emergency shields. From the darkness behind them, human stealth frigates uncloaked at close range and fired concentrated torpedo spreads into engines and command bridges. The surviving Council ships tried to turn, but it was too late. Destroyers from the human flank surged in, their hulls marked with the names of Earth's oceans and mountains, and cut through the trapped battle group with brutal speed. Hannah watched one Council cruiser split open from bow to stern, fire pouring from its broken center as escape pods scattered into the void. She had never seen war like this. It was not chaos. It was a lesson. Across the station, Council soldiers ran to defensive positions, but the deeper systems were already failing. Human cyber war teams had begun their work the moment the battle started, breaking relay codes, blinding targeting grids, and turning automated security layers into useless noise. In the Citadel Command Center, alarms overlapped so fast that officers could no longer tell which sectors were under attack. Doran demanded status from his outer patrols and received only fragments. Hangar 3 lost, North Shield down, unknown boarding signatures, reactor containment holding, request immediate, then static. Nari's hands moved over her console as new markers appeared on the display. Defense ring crippled. Enemy fleet cohesion collapsing. Boarding corridors open in 4 sectors. Jiho watched the battlefield without emotion. Launch Marine groups. Priority targets are Command, Weapons Control, and the High Executor. Civilian sectors remain protected. No one questioned the order. Human dropships detached from carriers and battleships, armored and narrow, escorted by gunships that tore through the debris cloud toward the Citadel's docking spine. Point defense fire rose to meet them, but human interceptors cut it down with exact bursts. Several dropships were hit and spun away burning, yet even that loss became part of the pattern, because behind them came a second wave using the wreckage as cover. In one of the lead assault craft stood Captain Sun, a broad-shouldered Marine officer with a scar across his chin and eyes like stone. Beside him, Lieutenant Era checked her weapon one final time while the hull shook from near impacts. Around them, the rest of the squad waited in silence. They were not shouting battle cries. They were listening to the mission feed and the name at the center of it all, Kongjun. When the dropship slammed against the Citadel hull and magnetic clamps locked, the red light inside turned green. "Go," Sun said, and the hatch blew open. The first human Marines entered the Council Citadel in a storm of smoke, sparks, and flying metal. Hannah heard the distant thunder of breaching charges through the archive walls and knew the battle had moved inside. She should have been afraid of the humans, and part of her was. But another part remembered June's face and Doran's laughter. And she felt something she had not expected in the middle of a war. Shame. She moved through emergency corridors toward a secure terminal, trying to pull sealed records before the system collapsed completely. What she found made her blood run cold. The Council had not only planned to humiliate Earth. They had already prepared follow-up orders to seize 3 human colonies, arrest all human envoys, and destroy civilian trade stations as examples. The execution had been the opening move, not a mistake made in anger. Hannah copied everything she could onto a portable core. If the humans were what the council claimed, they would kill everyone and burn the citadel. But if June's final warning meant anything, maybe truth still mattered. In the lower command decks, Sun's Marines cut through council defenders room by room. They moved fast, disciplined, and frighteningly precise, using stun bursts on surrendering personnel and lethal fire only when attacked. A group of council guards tried to make a stand at a weapons junction, and Era dropped the lead shooter with one clean burst before Sun's heavy rifle shattered the turret behind them. They advanced through smoke-filled corridors, stepping over broken drones and flickering light panels. Every few minutes, command updates reached them. Reactor secure, shield core disabled, military hangars taken, civilian domes untouched. That last part mattered. Human ships were still holding their fire from several angles because civilian structures were attached to the Citadel's outer rings. Jiho could have turned the station into vapor. He chose the harder path. Doran, however, chose madness. Realizing the station might fall, he ordered a contingency he had kept hidden from even his own counselors. Overload the Citadel's central reactor and blame the humans for the destruction. If he could not win, he would make a martyr's grave and a lie large enough to poison the whole galaxy. The order moved through a secret hardline channel, but Nari caught the signal fragment. Her face hardened. He's trying to scuttle the station. Jiho's voice dropped lower. Patch to all Marine teams. Reactor control becomes priority 1. Doran is now authorized for immediate capture or termination. Sun received the update as his squad reached a split corridor near the inner command ring. Era with me, he said, turning toward the reactor route while another team pushed toward the chamber. They ran through corridors shaking from distant explosions, the station groaning like a wounded beast. In the grand chamber above, Doran stood surrounded by fewer guards than before, his confidence finally breaking under the sound of battle inside his own fortress. Through the shattered observation wall behind his throne, he could see the impossible. Council warships dying in pieces, human formations tightening, more enemy reinforcements arriving from jump points the Council had thought blocked. For the first time in centuries, the ruler of the galaxy looked small. He shouted for retreat routes, for hidden escape craft, for anyone still loyal enough to save him. Few answered. Some guards threw down their weapons. Some ran. Some stayed only because they were too terrified to move. At that same moment, Hannah stepped out from a service passage near the inner records junction and nearly collided with a squad of human Marines. Their rifles snapped up at once. She froze, raising both hands, the data core clutched against her chest. Captain Sun emerged from behind them, armor marked with fresh burns and enemy fire. His helmet visor retracted, revealing a tired human face under the hard combat shell. Hannah expected rage. Instead, she saw control. "I have proof," she said in broken trade speech, forcing the words out. Council planned more attacks. Human colonies. Civilians. This was not only diplomat. Sun looked at her for one heartbeat, then at the data core. He stepped forward, took it carefully, and passed it to Era. "You come with us," he said. "Stay behind the line." There was no cruelty in his voice, only urgency. Above them, the station shook with a force so violent that dust rained from the ceiling. Nari's voice burst across marine channels. Reactor spike confirmed. 7 minutes to overload. Sun lifted his rifle and turned toward the core corridor. "Move!" As the human Marines sprinted deeper into the Citadel, as Jiho's fleet tightened its grip outside, and as the once untouchable Council began to collapse under the weight of its own crime, a single truth spread through every frightened witness still alive on Thalen Prime. The galaxy had not started a war with an angry species. It had started a war with a patient one, and patience, once broken, had become the deadliest weapon in the stars. With the Citadel shaking around them and the reactor warning screaming through every corridor, Captain Sun led his Marines deeper into the burning heart of the station, while Hannah stumbled behind Lieutenant Era, clutching the rail as the floor trembled under her feet, and above them, outside the shattered shell of the once proud Council fortress, The battle had already turned into a nightmare that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Admiral Jiho stood aboard the human flagship and watched the tactical display bloom with red wreckage and collapsing enemy signals as Council battle groups broke apart one by one under the pressure of human precision strikes. Yet he did not smile, because victory in the first battle meant nothing if Doran escaped or if the Citadel exploded with millions of civilians still trapped inside its outer rings. "Lock every escape vector," Jiho ordered, his voice steady and cold. "No one leaves without scan confirmation. Prioritize evacuation corridors. Civilian pods get right of passage." Commander Nari glanced at him, then relayed the command without hesitation. That one order spread across the system and stunned every witness who heard it. Human warships that had just torn apart Council cruisers with surgical brutality now shifted formation to protect civilian escape lanes, intercepting debris, clearing fire arcs, and even guiding damaged transport pods away from the station. The galaxy had expected human revenge to look like blind fire and endless slaughter. Instead, what it saw was something far more frightening: controlled war. On worlds far from Thalen Prime, hidden data relays and frightened observers began broadcasting the battle to neutral systems, to border colonies, to old archives and military academies, and as the footage spread, so did the truth the Council had buried for decades. Old sealed records opened in panic. Ancient warnings resurfaced. Historians, strategists, and frightened diplomats began digging through forgotten files, and everywhere they looked, they found the same pattern. Humanity had never been weak, only quiet. In a hidden research vault on the neutral world of Vea, an elderly scholar named Mira, one of the few remaining experts on early contact history, stared at a recovered Council war memo older than most living species. The file described the first human expansion era, when Earth's earliest colony ships had been attacked by pirates, trapped by hostile trade leagues, and betrayed by a frontier coalition that thought a young species would collapse under pressure. Instead, the memo ended with a line written by a dead Council analyst. "Humans do not break under repeated loss. They learn, adapt, and return with memory." Mira whispered the sentence aloud as she watched the live battle feed of Thalen Prime and realized the Council had just repeated the oldest mistake in galactic history. Back inside the Citadel, Sun's squad raced through a corridor full of smoke and failing lights, stepping over broken defense drones and stunned Council guards. Era checked the reactor map projected inside her visor and swore under her breath. "Main core access is sealed. We need to cut through maintenance spine 12. Sun didn't slow. "Do it." Behind them, Hannah tried to keep up, her breath ragged, her legs shaking from fear and exhaustion. She had never run beside soldiers before, much less human marines, and every instinct in her told her she should be dead already. But the humans moved around her like she was a protected asset, not a prisoner. That confused her more than the battle. She had grown up hearing Council stories that humans were unstable, emotional, dangerous in all the wrong ways. But these soldiers were dangerous in ways the stories had never described. They were calm, focused. They did not waste motion. They did not shout unless they had to. Even under fire, they seemed to carry some deep, disciplined anger that made them more terrifying than panic ever could. When they reached the maintenance hatch, one Marine planted charges while another covered the corridor. A moment later, the hatch blew inward and the squad dropped into a narrow service shaft humming with heat from the overloaded reactor below. The metal walls glowed faintly red. Warning klaxons pounded like a dying heartbeat. 5 minutes. Nari's voice came through the comm, reactor instability rising. Doran's signal last seen moving toward executive transit ring. Sun's jaw tightened. "Split teams. Era, take 3 and shut the overload down." "I'll go for Doran." Era turned to Hannah. "Stay with me." Hannah nodded, unable to speak. The squad split in opposite directions through the sweltering shaft. Sun climbed upward toward the executive ring, where Doran would be trying to flee or hide, while Era descended toward the reactor chamber with Hannah and 3 Marines at her back. Below them, the core chamber looked like the inside of a star. Massive magnetic rings spun around a column of violent blue-white energy, each layer groaning under stress as sabotage codes forced the reactor toward overload. Dead engineers floated near ruptured catwalks. Emergency drones sparked uselessly in corners. Era slid onto the nearest control platform and slammed a data spike into the main console. He locked it with hardline council encryption, she said, fingers moving fast. Manual override only. One of the Marines pointed toward a secondary junction across a broken bridge. We cut power there? Era nodded. Maybe. Or we all die faster. She looked at Hannah. Can you read council reactor script? Hannah swallowed, then stepped forward. Yes, I worked records, but I know enough. Era shifted aside without hesitation. Then help me. That simple trust hit Hannah harder than the alarms. She moved to the console and began translating the command layers, calling out code paths while Era bypassed security locks. For the first time in her life, Hannah was actively working against the council, and as she did, she remembered Kong Jun kneeling in the Grand Chamber, remembered his final words, and understood that she had already crossed that line the moment she chose not to stay silent. Above them, Sun and his Marines burst into the executive ring, just as Doran's remaining loyal guards tried to seal the final transit door. Blaster fire flashed across the corridor. One Marine took a hit to the shoulder and spun against the wall, but the rest returned fire in disciplined bursts. Sun advanced through the storm like a machine built for war, dropping one guard, then another, then smashing through the half-closed door with the force of his armored frame. Beyond it lay the private escape platform of the High Executor, a polished chamber of gold metal and glass now filled with smoke and panic. Doran stood near a sleek emergency shuttle, surrounded by only 4 guards and 2 terrified aides. His ceremonial robes were burned at the edges. His face, once so proud in the council chamber, now looked twisted by fear and disbelief. You primitive animal, he spat when he saw Sunday. Do you know what you've done? The galaxy will never accept human rule. Sun raised his rifle, then lowered it slightly when he saw the aides cowering behind the shuttle ramp. I'm not here to rule your galaxy, he said, his voice flat. I'm here because you murdered a protected envoy. Doran barked a laugh that sounded broken. One human. For this? Sun's eyes hardened. No, for what it meant. Before Doran could answer, one of the loyal guards lunged from cover with a heavy pulse rifle. Sun fired first. The guard fell. Another opened up from the shuttle ramp and hit the glass wall behind the Marines, showering the chamber in shards. Sun's team cut them down in seconds, but Doran used the chaos to rush toward the shuttle cockpit. Sun sprinted after him and slammed into the side hatch just as it began to seal. Metal screamed. Servos buckled. With raw force and powered armor strength, he ripped the hatch back open enough to drag Doran out by the arm. The old ruler hit the deck hard, snarling, striking, still unable to understand that his power meant nothing now. Sun pinned him with one knee and locked restraint cuffs around his wrists. Target secured, he said into comms. Doran alive. On the flagship, Jiho closed his eyes for half a second. Good. Bring him out. But the battle was far from over. Across the wider galaxy, the Council's reaction to Doran's capture became chaos. Some member species immediately began sending surrender codes. Others refused to believe the Citadel could fall and launched emergency fleets toward Thalen Prime. Hardline admirals, desperate to preserve the illusion of power, ordered strikes on human border colonies before news could spread. That was the moment the second phase of the war began. In the outer human systems, long-hidden defense networks awakened as if they had been waiting for this exact hour. Around the colony of New Busan, where farmers and engineers had lived under the shadow of quiet moons, Council raiders jumped into orbit expecting a soft target. Instead, they found layered mine belts, orbital rail platforms hidden inside civilian shipping lanes, and reserve frigates that had been disguised for years as cargo hulls. Within minutes, the raiding fleet was shattered. On the icy world of Hanul, where mining domes clung to frozen cliffs, a Council cruiser group tried to bombard the surface, only to be struck from beneath the planet's rings by submarine launch carriers hidden inside the ice. Across human space, the same pattern repeated. Every attack route the Council chose seemed already studied. Every trap they set was already anticipated. It was as if humanity had spent decades preparing for a war everyone else believed would never come. Neutral worlds watched in growing shock as old records surfaced to explain why. Humans had endured poisoned skies on Earth, orbital civil wars, machine uprisings, famine on early colonies, and first contact massacres no one in the Council had ever admitted. Every crisis had changed them. Every scar had become doctrine. While the galaxy built comfort and ceremony, Earth had built redundancy, logistics, fallback plans, hidden shipyards, deep shelters, and fleets within fleets. Humanity's peace had never been helplessness. It had been restraint. In the reactor chamber, Era and Hannah finally broke through the last lock. "I've got manual control," Era said, sweat running down her temple despite the cooling suit. "Diverting overload now." The magnetic rings around the core screamed louder, then began to slow. The blue-white energy column shrank by a fraction. Warning lights shifted from crimson to amber. Everyone on the catwalk held their breath. Then the overload count froze. The station gave one violent shudder, but the reactor stabilized. Across the Citadel, lights flickered back to emergency balance instead of total collapse. On the command deck, Nari let out the breath she had been holding. "Reactor contained." Jiho nodded once. "Begin station-wide surrender broadcast." A new human transmission rolled across every corridor, every ship, every escape pod, every hidden terminal in the system. "High Executor Doran is in custody. Reactor threat neutralized. All Council military units are ordered to stand down. Civilian evacuation remains protected. Any continued resistance will be treated as hostile command action." For many listening, that message changed everything. Council crews who had been fighting out of fear began laying down weapons. Dock workers emerged from hiding. Foreign diplomats who had expected death stared in disbelief as human medics entered civilian sectors instead of execution squads. Hannah stood beside Era on the reactor platform, shaking with exhaustion, and looked at the human officer with something close to awe. "Why?" she asked softly. "After what he did, why save this place?" Era wiped soot from her face and glanced toward the glowing reactor core. "Because June came here to stop a war," she said. "If we become what Doran wanted, then he dies for nothing." Hannah had no answer to that. Hours later, as Doran was dragged in restraints through the same grand chamber where Kong Jun had been executed, the surviving witnesses watched in silence. The broken thrones of the Council floated above like ruins. Smoke drifted through shattered light beams. Human marines lined the chamber, but none struck the fallen ruler. None mocked him. None screamed for blood. Admiral Jiho himself entered only long enough to stand in the center where June had died. He looked up at the Ring of Thrones, then at Doran, then at the recording drones now capturing every second for the whole galaxy. "You killed a man under law," Jiho said. "You attacked peace and called it strength. Now the galaxy will see what that cost." Outside the Citadel, fresh jump signatures began appearing at the edge of the system. Council reinforcements rushing in too late, neutral observers arriving to witness history, and beyond them all, deeper in the dark, the leading elements of even larger human fleets emerging in silent formation. Thalen Prime had not been the end of the war. It had only been the first answer. And as every world in the galaxy watched the once untouchable Council capital burn under the shadow of Earth's warships, one terrible truth became impossible to deny. The Council had not executed one helpless human diplomat. It had executed the last chance the galaxy had to avoid the storm now coming. The fall of Thalen Prime should have ended the war before it truly began. But across the galaxy, fear and pride were stronger than reason. And when the image of High Executor Doran in restraints spread across every system, the Galactic Council did not collapse in peace. It shattered into panic, rage, and desperate violence. Some worlds surrendered within hours, cutting power to their military relays and begging for terms before Earth's fleets reached their skies. Others accused each other of betrayal and sealed their borders, hoping the storm would pass around them. But the hardest and cruelest factions of the Council, the ones who had built their power on fear for centuries, refused to accept that a single human death had already changed history. Hidden admirals, war ministers, and old noble houses gathered in secret war chambers, swearing that if the Council's heart had been broken, Then they would strike at Earth's heart in return. They named themselves the Iron Circle, and their first decision was as brutal as it was foolish. They would bypass the major human fleets and attack a human colony where civilians, children, and supply yards would be exposed, then broadcast the destruction across the galaxy to force humanity into chaos. They chose New Dehan, a growing human colony world on the edge of the Helios corridor, rich in ship metals and fuel refineries, protected by only one visible defense flotilla and several civilian stations. To the Iron Circle, it looked like a weak target. To humanity, it was home. On New Dehan, the morning sky was pale gold when the first warning sirens began to scream across the colony domes, and families stopped in the streets. Workers froze in refinery towers, and children looked up through glass roofs as defense satellites turned in perfect unison toward the outer dark. In the Capitol dome, Governor Eunice stood in the emergency command center with her hands pressed against the edge of the main table, while officers shouted over one another. She was not a soldier by training, but like many colonial governors, she had once served in crisis command during the long expansion years. Beside her stood Colonel Tay, the leader of the local defense force, a quiet man with a hard face and old scars across one hand. A sensor officer looked up, pale and breathless. Multiple jump ruptures. Confirmed hostile. At least 3 council heavy groups and carrier support. Another voice followed. No, correction, 5 groups. More coming behind them. The room fell silent for one heartbeat, because everyone there understood what that meant. The visible defense flotilla above New Dehan could not stop that kind of force. Colonel Tay looked at Yuna, and she saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke it. If they commit fully, they can break orbit. Yuna straightened, forcing fear down into a cold place where it could not rule her. Then we buy time. Orders moved at once. Civilian evacuation routes opened under every dome. Children were rushed to shield bunkers buried deep beneath the colony bedrock. Cargo trams became medical transports. Mining crews shut down drills and opened blast tunnels leading to emergency shelters. Across the orbital yards, dockworkers abandoned half-built freighters and ran to defense stations they had trained for but prayed never to use. On the surface, New Dehan did not panic. Transformed. Above the world, the Iron Circle fleet emerged from jump space like a wall of steel and fire. Cruisers, carriers, missile barges, and heavy destroyers spread into bombardment lines, while their commanders prepared to erase the colony in a single public strike. Leading the assault was Lord Marshal Varek, an old council warlord whose family had ruled 3 sectors through terror long before Doran had risen to power. He stared at the blue-white world below and smiled when he saw only one human flotilla forming between him and the planet. So this is their famous discipline, he said. A token shield. His officers laughed, but the laughter died when the human flotilla moved. Instead of charging or retreating, the ships fell into an unusual pattern, leaving small gaps between them as if inviting attack. Varek took the bait without hesitation and ordered his forward cruisers into the openings, expecting to split the line and crush the defenders from within. The moment his ships crossed those invisible thresholds, the darkness around them came alive. Thousands of dormant mines, hidden for years among shipping routes, asteroid fragments, and even abandoned cargo containers, activated at once. Some detonated with blinding force, ripping shields apart. Others released swarms of cutting drones that burrowed into engines and weapon mounts. Entire council formations staggered in confusion as the empty spaces between the human ships became death zones. Before Varek could recover, the civilian orbital yards he had ignored began to unfold. Cargo cranes rotated into gun platforms. Fuel depots opened armored plates to reveal missile racks. Half-built freighters shed false hull panels and ignited concealed drive cores, transforming into reserve defense ships that launched directly from dock. The colony had looked weak because it had been built to look weak. On the ground, Yuna watched the battle through the command dome's tactical projection as red icons vanished in sudden clusters. How many hidden platforms? She asked. Colonel Tay allowed himself the faintest breath of grim satisfaction. Enough to surprise them. Yet even with traps and hidden weapons, the Iron Circle fleet was enormous, and Varek was too experienced to fall for the same trick twice. Roaring in anger, He pulled his shattered vanguard back and reformed his main line, then ordered the carriers to launch wave after wave of strike craft toward the planet. The sky above New Dahan filled with enemy bombers and assault drones, a black storm descending toward the domes. Human defense guns opened from orbit and surface at once, painting the atmosphere with streaks of fire, but there were too many. Several outer stations exploded. One civilian refinery ring took a direct hit and burst into flame, scattering molten wreckage through the upper atmosphere. In the lower dome districts, families huddled in shelters while the ground trembled. In the med bays, nurses and volunteers carried the wounded, while old veterans took up rifles to guard access tunnels. Humanity's strength had never lived only in its warships. It lived in ordinary people who knew how to endure. In the Helios corridor, far beyond New Dahan, the emergency signal reached the main human strike groups moving deeper into former council space. Admiral Jiho saw the colony alert appear across his tactical wall and went still for half a second. Commander Nari read the incoming numbers and understood at once. Iron Circle bypass attack. They're going for civilians. Jiho's face changed in a way few on his bridge had ever seen. It was not rage in the wild sense. It was something colder and far more dangerous. Vector all available fast elements to New Dahan. Recall Group 7 from pursuit. Patch me to Admiral Min. A moment later, the face of Admiral Min appeared on the command screen from another fleet cluster. An older woman with white at her temples and eyes like sharpened glass. She had spent 30 years building the rapid response doctrine that the galaxy once mocked as paranoid. Jiho gave her only the facts. Her answer was immediate. I'll be there first. She cut the line before anyone could say more. Across hidden routes known only to human command, reserve fleets changed course. Stealth destroyers broke from ambush positions. Long-range jump beacons awakened in systems the Council believed uninhabited. Humanity's war machine did not rush in chaos. Pivoted. Back at New Dahan, Varric finally forced a breach in the outer defense screen. His heavy cruisers pushed through burning mine clouds and opened direct fire on the upper orbital shield lattice. One by one, shield nodes burst apart. Warning lights flooded Yuna's command center as the main dome barrier flickered. If they get one clear bombardment line, we lose the northern cities, an officer shouted. Colonel Tay looked at the tactical map, then made a decision that froze the room. Prepare the shipyard drop. Yuna turned to him sharply. That will destroy the yards. Tay met her gaze. If we don't, they destroy the planet. She held his stare for a single breath, then nodded. Do it. High above the colony, the largest orbital shipyard in the system, an enormous skeletal structure where new carriers were being built, detached from its stabilizers. Varric's officers noticed too late. The entire structure, still burning from previous hits, ignited emergency thrusters and drove itself directly into the densest part of the Council attack line. It was not a graceful weapon. It was a city-sized hammer of steel, fuel, and unfinished warships. The collision shattered 2 enemy cruisers outright and threw the rest of the line into violent disarray. Explosions rolled across the void like chained suns. On the surface, every human watching new workers had remained aboard to guide the final impact. No one in the command center spoke their names, but everyone understood what had just been given. Varric roared in fury and ordered full planetary bombardment. No more caution, no more symbolic strike. If he could not humiliate the humans, he would scar them forever. His surviving battleships angled downward. Energy gathered in their forward arrays. And then space behind his fleet split open. Not in one place, but in dozens. New jump signatures tore across the dark in perfect combat spacing, and from them came the first of Admiral Min's response force. Sleek human destroyers and battlecruisers arriving at attack velocity so high the Council sensors nearly failed trying to track them. At their center emerged Min's flagship, a long black warship with no ceremonial lines, only armor, engines, and weapons built for one purpose. Her voice cut across every channel in the system, calm and merciless. This is Earth Rapid Fleet. You targeted a civilian world. All hostile forces are now marked for extinction. The battle that followed became legend before it even ended. Human fast squadrons did not stop to form traditional lines. They plunged straight into the Iron Circle formation in layered assault waves, using momentum, crossfire geometry, and data-linked firing solutions that made them seem almost prophetic. Destroyers slipped under the shields of larger enemy hulls and gutted them with close-range rail bursts. Missile corvettes launched decoy swarms that drew defensive fire away from heavier torpedoes. Strike craft rose from hidden bays in the colony's surviving stations and joined the assault from below, while Min's flagship cut through the center with a broadside that broke Varric's lead carrier in half. The Council had expected a rescue. What arrived was an execution. Yet even then, the humans did not lose control. Surface defense continued to prioritize shielding the domes. Medical ships moved under escort. Civilian corridors remained protected. The contrast was so sharp that neutral observers across nearby systems began openly broadcasting support for Earth, while some former Council members refused orders to reinforce Varric at all. The lie of human savagery was dying in real time. On the bridge of his crippled flagship, Varric watched his fleet come apart and finally understood the same truth Doran had understood too late. Humanity had not entered this war unprepared. It had built itself around the certainty that one day, someone in the galaxy would mistake peace for weakness. He tried to flee. Admiral Min denied him that chance. Her ships boxed in his escape vectors with such exact timing that his navigation officer thought the stars themselves had moved. One final volley from Min's flagship punched through Varric's engines and command core, leaving the warlord's ship dead in space as the rest of the Iron Circle fleet collapsed into surrender, wreckage, or fire. On New Dehan, the bombardment threat faded. The domes still stood, though several outer districts burned and thousands were wounded. In the shelters, children began to cry not from fear but from the release of it. In the command center, Una sat down for the first time in hours, her hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. Colonel Tay looked at the casualty reports, the destroyed shipyard, the names of the workers who had stayed behind, and said quietly, "They came in time." Una looked up at the tactical display where Earth's warships now formed a shield around the colony, and her voice was steady despite the grief in it. "No," she said. "They were always coming." Across the galaxy, the Battle of New Dehan changed the war more than the fall of Thalen Prime ever could. It showed every watching species that humans were not just powerful in attack, they were unbreakable in defense. They would sacrifice shipyards, fortunes, fleets, and even their own lives before letting civilians be slaughtered. They would answer cruelty with force, but never confusion. And as reports of the Iron Circle's failed atrocity spread, something else began to happen in hidden rooms and frightened capitals. Worlds that had once obeyed the Council out of fear began sending quiet messages to Earth, asking for protection, for surrender, or for a place in whatever future came after the old order died. Far away, in a secure holding chamber aboard Jiho's flagship, Doran watched the battle replay on a silent screen and finally understood the full size of his crime. He had thought he had executed one man in a show of power. Instead, he had lit a fire that no empire in the galaxy could now contain. After the Battle of New Dehan, the war no longer belonged to the old Council, because what had once been a proud empire of fear was now a broken machine running on panic, lies, and the last stubborn pride of men who could not accept that their age had ended. And as more worlds abandoned the Council and more fleets either surrendered or vanished into deep space, the surviving leaders of the Iron Circle made one final choice that would either save their power or destroy everything in the galaxy. They retreated beyond the known trade lanes to a dead fortress world called Terran, a black planet hidden inside a dust nebula where ancient Council rulers had once buried forbidden weapons and secret command vaults. There, under layers of armored rock and mountain-sized shields, the last war ministers, admirals, and noble lords gathered around a weapon they had sworn never to reveal. The Crown of Ash, an ancient stellar cannon built in a forgotten age, capable of focusing enough energy to burn a planet's surface into glass. This first target was Earth. They no longer spoke of victory in the old way. They no longer believed they could defeat humanity fleet against fleet. Their only hope was terror. If Earth burned, they believed the human colonies would fracture, the fleets would lose command, and the galaxy would crawl back to whatever scraps of order remained. But humanity had spent too many years preparing for enemies who mistook fear for strength, and long before the Crown of Ash reached firing charge, Hidden scouts, listening drones, and deep cover agents began to piece together the shape of the trap. On the command deck of the flagship Resolute Dawn, Admiral Jiho stood beneath a hollow map of the Terran system while Commander Nari, Admiral Min, Captain Sun, Lieutenant Era, Governor Yuna, and several allied officers from former Council worlds watched in tense silence. The projection showed Terran wrapped in defense rings, mine clouds, fortress satellites, and hundreds of remaining Iron Circle warships drawn inward around the planet like desperate wolves protecting their last den. At the center of the display, pulsing red beneath the crust, was the crown of ash. "Time to firing?" Jiho asked. Nari's answer came without softness. "At current charge, under 7 hours. Less if they force the cycle." Min crossed her arms and studied the overlapping fields of enemy fire. "A direct push will cost us half the fleet before we touch the shield shell." Sun leaned forward. "Then we don't touch it from the front." Hannah, now standing among them as an official witness and intelligence advisor after what she had done at Thalen Prime, pointed toward an old geological seam beneath the southern hemisphere of Terran. There was a maintenance route here in the old archives. It was built for cooling tunnels during the first construction phase. The Council sealed it from public records, but they never erased it completely. Era looked at the data and gave a short nod. If that tunnel still exists, a strike team could reach the inner power relays. Kill the shield from inside. Jiho's eyes moved from the map to each face around him. He knew what the plan meant. One fleet would hold back the largest concentration of surviving enemy power while another would break openings, and a small team would descend into the fortress world itself to destroy the weapon before Earth's skies became fire. "Then this ends today," he said. The order spread through the human armada and the allied fleets that had chosen to stand beside Earth, and in the dark beyond Terran, the greatest force the galaxy had ever seen began to form. Human dreadnoughts lined up beside former Council cruisers now flying surrender banners and new alliance codes. Fast destroyer groups drifted between carriers. Medical ships and rescue frigates held back behind shield walls. Reserve fleets arrived from hidden routes one after another until the stars themselves seemed crowded with steel. Across every open channel, Earth sent one final broadcast toward Terran. "Power down the crown of ash. Release all command keys. Surrender your war leadership. This is the last offer." The answer came from the last voice of the Iron Circle, Chancellor Vor, a severe old ruler who had once advised Doran and now carried the dead empire's final madness in his eyes. His image appeared over the channels, pale and proud inside a bunker of black metal. "You call this justice," he said, "but you bring fleets to our world and demand obedience. You are no different from us." Jiho answered without anger. "If we were like you, Earth would already be ash under your own weapon. Shut it down." Vor smiled a thin, broken smile. "Then come stop me." The Battle of Terran began with silence, and then with light so violent it seemed to tear the dark apart. Human rail batteries opened from extreme range, their rounds crossing the void in white lines that smashed into the outer mine belts and cleared corridors through fields that had waited centuries for this moment. Council fortress satellites answered with beams of blue plasma and swarms of missiles, but Min's fast squadrons surged ahead like a storm front, cutting through the first layer before the defenders could adjust. Allied ships followed, some of them commanded by species who had once feared humans more than they trusted them, and now fought beside Earth because they had seen what the Council truly was. Above Terran, war became a wall of fire. Dreadnoughts traded broadsides at ranges so close their shattered armor lit the battlefield like broken suns. Carriers emptied whole wings of strike craft into point defense storms. Human destroyers dived between wrecks and debris, using the chaos as cover to hit shield emitters and command relays. On the Resolute Dawn, Nari tracked the shifting lines with relentless focus. Northern ring weakening, southern shell still holding. Crown charge at 82%. Jiho's gaze never left the center. Open the path. At his order, the human fleet executed a maneuver the galaxy would later study for decades. A wedge of heavily armored battleships drove directly into the southern defense arc, absorbing punishment that would have broken ordinary fleets, while hidden stealth frigates, masked behind sensor ghosts and wreck signatures, slipped under the crossfire and struck the buried shield projectors beneath the surface crust. For one brief moment, a gap opened. It was small. It was unstable. It was enough. "Son," Jiho said. "Go." Captain Sun, Lieutenant Era, Hannah, and a handpicked strike team were already strapped into a black assault lander built for one-way missions. The moment the shield gap appeared, their craft dropped through it like a blade. Enemy flak ripped the sky around them. One escort gunship exploded above them in a burst of fire. Another spun off trailing smoke. Sun's lander slammed through the upper storm layer and into the volcanic dark of Terran, diving toward a narrow canyon where the ancient cooling tunnels lay buried under ash and old stone. The landing was hard enough to throw everyone against their restraints, but the craft held. "Move!" Sun barked as the ramp dropped into a world of black wind, falling ash, and distant artillery thunder. The strike team ran into the canyon while battle raged in the sky above like a second sun being born and dying every second. Hannah led them to a sealed blast door half buried in rock, her hands shaking as she matched the old code patterns against the panel. "It's here," she said. "If the archive was true, this leads to the inner conduits." Era planted breaching charges. The door blew inward, and the team entered the buried veins of the old empire. Inside Terran, the fortress tunnels were a maze of old steel, reactor heat, and emergency red light. Automated defenses came alive at once, but the Marines cut them down with ruthless speed. They moved past old storage chambers, sealed prisons, abandoned machine bays, and ancient walls carved with the symbols of the Council's first age. Every step deeper felt like walking through the skeleton of the Empire itself. Over comms, Nari's voice snapped through bursts of static. "Crown charge at 89%. Fleet losses rising. You're out of time." Above them, the battle worsened. Vor had committed everything. The remaining Iron Circle warships fought like men already dead, ramming human hulls, launching suicidal torpedo runs, and detonating their own reactors inside Allied formations. Admiral Min's flagship took a direct hit that tore open 2 decks and killed half a command section. But she stayed on the bridge and drove her ship deeper into the center, splitting the enemy line so Jiho's heavier ships could push through. On the surface, Sun's team reached the first relay chamber and found it guarded by elite Iron Circle troops in heavy armor. The corridor became a killing ground. Blaster fire lit the darkness in violent flashes. One human Marine fell. Another dragged him back while returning fire. Era flanked left, shot out a shield node, and Sun charged through the opening like a hammer, dropping 2 defenders at close range before slamming the last into the wall. Hannah stared at the bodies only for a second before forcing herself onward. There was no room left for shock. At the second relay, they found the main control junction feeding power to the Crown's outer stabilizers. "I can cut it," Era said, sliding into the console. "But they'll reroute unless we overload the feed." Sun understood what that meant. "Do it." She looked up at him, just once. He nodded. No more words were needed. Era bypassed the locks and set the stabilizer channel into reverse surge. The chamber shook as power screamed backward through the grid. Somewhere far above, the outer shield over Terran flickered and collapsed across half the planet. In orbit, Jiho saw the opening and did not hesitate. All heavy batteries, target Fortress Crown. The human fleet fired as one. Rail rounds, plasma lances, and mass drivers tore into the exposed defense towers above the Crown of Ash, smashing gun emplacements and cracking armor domes. But deep below, Vor still had manual control of the weapon, and the ancient cannon began final ignition. 96%, Nari warned, her voice tight for the first time. "They're forcing it." Sun's team sprinted toward the core chamber at the center of the mountain, where the Crown's final firing controls waited behind the last blast gate. They were almost there when the corridor ahead opened and Chancellor Vor himself appeared with a final squad of guards. He wore no robe now, only black command armor, and in his hand was a control rod linked directly to the firing circuit. "You are too late," he said, his voice calm in a way that made him sound more broken than brave. "If the Council dies, Earth dies with it." Sun raised his rifle. No, the last fight was short and brutal. Vor's guards opened fire. 2 Marines went down. Era dropped 1 guard. Hannah, with no weapon, slammed a loose tool bar into another when he rushed her, shocking herself as much as him. Sun and Vor collided at the threshold of the control gate, the old Chancellor striking wildly with the rod while Sun blocked, drove forward, and forced him back step by step. Vor spat in his face and shouted that fear was the only law the galaxy ever obeyed. Sun answered by wrenching the control rod free and throwing Vor against the gate so hard the old ruler collapsed. Then he shot the locking mechanism and kicked the final door open. Inside, the crown's heart glowed like a trapped star. Era rushed to the main console and saw the truth immediately. It won't stop in software. They built it to fire through override. We have to destroy the core. Sun looked at the chamber, the heat, the unstable energy lines, the narrow maintenance shaft leading straight into the focusing array. He made the choice in one breath. Set charges. Era turned sharply. Sun, set them. She understood. Her face hardened, but her hands moved. Hannah felt the air leave her lungs as she realized what he meant. The only way to place the charges deep enough was by hand, inside the focusing shaft, and there would not be time to come back. Sun handed his rifle to a surviving Marine, took the charge pack and looked once at Era. No speeches, no tears, only trust. Tell Jiho the road is open, he said. Then he stepped into the blazing light. The seconds that followed seemed to stretch across the whole galaxy. In orbit, human fleets held the line while the Crown's energy climbed toward disaster. On Earth, old men and children watched emergency skies and waited. In the core chamber, Era triggered the final detonation sequence while Hannah held Vor at gunpoint with shaking hands. Somewhere inside the shaft, Captain Sun planted the charges where no machine could reach. Nari's voice cracked through comms. 99%. Era hit the trigger. For one terrible instant, nothing happened. Then the heart of the crown of ash tore itself apart. The mountain shook. A column of white fire punched upward through Karen's crust, not toward Earth, but into the empty sky, shredding the cannon, the control chambers, and the fortress around it. Shockwaves raced through the tunnels. Era grabbed Hannah and threw both of them behind a collapsed support as the world came apart. Above Karen, the blast ripped through the remaining Iron Circle defenses. The last enemy ships lost formation, lost command, lost hope. Some surrendered immediately. Some tried to flee. Human fleets cut off the escape routes. Within minutes, the battle was over. The final weapon was dead. The old empire had no more teeth. Hours later, as rescue teams pulled survivors from the broken tunnels and med ships crossed the black sky above Karen, the news spread from ship to ship, world to world, colony to colony. Earth still lived. The crown of ash had fallen. The war was over. Chancellor Vor was taken alive, just as Doran had been. The last Iron Circle admirals laid down their command keys. The surviving council worlds, terrified and exhausted, waited to see what humanity would do next. They expected conquest. They expected occupation. They expected the same cruel rule they had known for centuries, only with new faces. Instead, Admiral Jiho stood before the captured leaders and every open broadcast in the galaxy and gave an answer no one expected. He said Earth would not build a new council. Earth would not rule by fear. The old throne was dead. In its place, there would be a new alliance, one world, one voice, no secret law, no hidden prisons, no executions under false justice, and every smaller species protected under mutual defense. He ordered humanitarian aid sent first to the worlds the Council had starved during the war. He opened protected corridors for surrendering fleets. He demanded trials, not massacres. And when they built the first memorial on the ruins of Thalen Prime, they did not make it for admirals or kings. They made it for Kong Jun, the unarmed human envoy who had walked into the council chamber with peace in his hands and died because tyrants mistook patience for weakness. Beside his name, they later added another, Captain Sun, who had walked into the fire so Earth would never see the sky burn. In the years that followed, children on 100 worlds learned the same lesson their parents had learned in fear. Humans did not seek war, and that was what made them so dangerous when war finally came. They would endure what others could not. They would protect what others abandoned. They would answer cruelty with force, but not become cruel themselves. The Council had believed it executed one human and taught the galaxy a lesson. Instead, on that day, it killed the last chance for an empire built on fear, awakened Earth's hidden fleets, and handed the future of the stars to the very species it had feared too late.